is I'm going to talk to you about King John and talk to you about King John's image. And part of the reason for doing that, of course, although we're thinking about Magna Carta is centre stage for all the celebrations that we've been having and all the things we've been thinking about. In many ways, John too plays a central role in the story of Magna Carta, and he certainly has played a central role in the story of Magna Carta during the last few weeks about the celebration. What you see before you is the effigy of King John's tomb as it appears to us today. It's at Worcester Cathedral. We know quite a lot about its production. We know quite a lot about it and why it is situated where it is. It's in this particular location. It's in the choir of the cathedral. Has anybody actually been to Worcester and seen? So you'll know where it is. It is in this central location. It's actually a fantastic place because it makes it absolutely the centre of the liturgical routine of the community. And it's the centre of the liturgical routine of the community now, just as it was when it was placed in that location. We're pretty certain that it was placed in that location in 1232. There was a great celebration during Ascension Tide, and this celebration took place with Henry III, John's son, and Eleanor, his daughter, along with a series of other great luminaries of Henry III's court, and it was placed in this particular location by the community at Worcester. And it's not by accident that it's there. I should say that this thing that you see here, the altar tomb, that the effigy actually sits on, is a product of the 16th century. It was actually put there by the Tudors, because also at Worcester Cathedral is the tomb of Henry VII's eldest son, who I want to call Arthur. Is that right? Yes, absolutely. And at the same point that Arthur was being placed in his tomb, they made a new altar tomb for King John. So that's why he sat on that altar tomb itself. But the location, the current location, seems to have been the product of a decision that was made in the 1220s. We know that John wanted to be buried at Worcester. This is a copy of his testament. It's the earliest surviving original testament of an English medieval king, and it still survives at the archives in the monuments at Worcester Cathedral. And you can see that from this that it's sealed, or would have been sealed, by the seals of those who were witnessing the will. And actually in the will he says that he wanted to be buried at Worcester, at the Church of St Wulstan and St Mary at Worcester. And I take this around with me whenever I talk about the will, because it's quite an interesting piece of, how can I put this? Blue Peter sticky back plastic example of what the size of the will actually is. It's actually a tiny little thing. You can see it's nicely blown up there so you can see it, but it's actually physically a tiny little thing, and it's obvious that it was stored in this particular form, tiny little form, in the Worcester archives. So it's not there. The body is not in its current location by accident. It's at Worcester. It's actually at Worcester Cathedral because John wanted it to be to lay amongst the monks of Worcester, amongst the monks of that particular community. And it was probably chosen by John at that particular point because John was a great fan, seems to have been a great fan of St Wulstan, one of the key people in the early history of the community at Worcester. He was the person who engineered the building of the new cathedral in the new Romanesque style at the end of the 11th century, and this is the Romanesque cathedral that John would have known. the Romanesque cathedral into which John was buried. And it seems that John played a part in the canonisation of Wulfstan. Wulfstan was canonised in 1203, one of the first of the English saints to be canonised in the approved manner, going through the processes that the Roman Church dictated. In terms of its actual location then, in the choir, it seems that this location was determined by the community, not by John himself. John expresses a desire to be buried at Worcester, but the actual location seems to have been one chosen by the community. And it seems to me that the setting is absolutely crucial, because there it is, it's at the centre of the religious rites, and it makes John the centre of the community. It very much turns John, I suppose, or turns the monastic community at Worcester into a royal mausoleum. But why might you want to put such a rotten king here at this particular location? Why might you want to do this? If John is such an appalling individual, why do you want him at the very heart of your community? And I think the answer to that question is very much based on what happens to Worcester during the 50 or so years after 1224. There's a remarkable book by a German scholar called Uta Engel, who has gone through all the records, the monastic records and the royal records, and she has shown that during the period between 1224 and sometime into the 1270s, early 1280s, Worcester Cathedral was completely rebuilt. The Worcester Cathedral that you see today was completely rebuilt on the back of royal funding, and it was completely rebuilt in that new 13th century Gothic style. So it seems that the real reason why the monks at Worcester wanted to hold on to John's body was because Henry, John's son, was going to be a great source of revenue in order to allow them to rebuild their community. But it wasn't a straightforward story, because in 1227 there was a dispute about what should happen to John's body. This dispute was started by the Abbot of Beaulieu. Now, Beaulieu was a Cistercian foundation founded by King John around 1203 or 1204, and it was widely thought that he founded Beaulieu in order to be his royal mausoleum. But in 1216, Beaulieu in Hampshire was, of course, in rebel hands. It was in the hands of the French. And so there was no way at all that John's body could be buried at Beaulieu, even if that's what he wanted. But as you can see from the will, he'd actually made a decision in 1216 that he wanted to be buried at Worcester. Well, by the time we get to the late 1220s, the Abbot of Beaulieu is attempting to get John's body repatriated, as he would see it, to Beaulieu. And in 1227, he'd launched a case. He'd launched a case at the papal curia, and he had in his hand what he thought was his trump card. And his trump card was a letter from Henry III saying that he actually agreed that his father's body should be moved from Worcester, where it was resting in 1227, to Beaulieu. Now, clearly, something happened in the intervening years, because in 1232, it's very clear that Henry III was perfectly happy for his father's body to be laid to rest and to remain in its location at Worcester. And it seems to me that there are a series of initiatives that the monks have launched in order to persuade Henry III that theirs is the correct location. There's actually a campaign for the heart and mind of Henry III. From the literary evidence, from the documentary evidence, we know that the monks were promising to sing masses for John twice a day for the rest of eternity, well, at least until the Reformation. We're told also that they are prepared to sing the royal anthem as well, once a day, again throughout the whole of eternity. So that's the sort of documentary evidence which seems to suggest that Henry III was happy for his father now to remain at Worcester. But there's also this, what I would argue, is this physical part of the campaign that the monks of Worcester were undertaking. Because what they seem to have done is commission this tomb effigy. And in terms of the artistry of this tomb effigy, it is pure early 13th century, it's 1220, so it fits in terms of the, very much fits in terms of the style of the early 13th century. He's also, the artist is also telling us a series of tales in this particular effigy. So here we have, I hope you can see, the king's head. And don't worry about this tin crown, I'll tell you a story about this tin crown in a moment. But there he is, there's his head, very much in, I would argue, a spiritual world, because on either side we have these two bishops. Now, the argument goes that these two bishops aren't just any old bishops. They're in fact the two saintly bishops of Worcester. And in fact, we have a near contemporary chronicler who argued that, or said that, John wanted to be buried between these two particular saints, St. Oswald and St. Wulstan. And St. Oswald was the key character in terms of founding Worcester Cathedral, or Worcester monastic community in the 10th century. He was the Anglo-Saxon bishop who turned Worcester into that Benedictine community, the Benedictine community that it was going to remain right the way down to the Reformation. And of course, we've already met Wulstan. And here they are as bishops with their thuribles wafting the king's head. It's an interesting question as to what they're actually doing in this particular scene. Does it mean that the king's head is in heaven and that he is being wafted by these saintly bishops during the process of the Mass? Presumably it means something like that. The last time I talked about this, the now Bishop of Worcester took me to one side afterwards and said, "Dear boy, you've got that entirely wrong. He is in fact in purgatory, and these bishops are trying to get him out of purgatory." Well, I'm not going to argue with a bishop, but it's very clear that it's a sympathetic image. It's an image of, if not John saved, John going through the process of salvation. And it's not just about the iconography of this world either, because it's also about the iconography of, or so I should say, not just about the iconography of the next world, it's also about the iconography of this world too, because he's there in his coronation regalia. I hope you can see. Well, we've seen the rather dodgy tin crown, but it in fact overlay a stone crown. And there he is in his coronation robes. And he would have been, the assumption is he would have been holding some sort of wand here, a scepter perhaps. He's holding a sword here, and there he is with his coronation spurs and standing on this stone lion. So it's an image of a king, very clearly. It's an image of a king who is, if not in heaven, on his way to heaven, being interceded for on behalf of the king's soul by these sainted bishops. And it's clearly an image of a king in his coronation regalia. And the sword is the thing that I want you to particularly focus on at the moment, because the sword is very interesting. I think that iconographically, I can't think of another example where there is an effigy of a medieval king with a drawn sword. There are plenty of effigies with kings with swords, but here's an effigy of a drawn sword. And clearly the effigy is supposed to remind us of the coronation ritual, when the bishops actually hand to the king the sword by which he is going to exercise justice. He's stood on a lion. Now the lion is an interesting one in terms of the iconography of this one. When you look up lion, one of the things you discover is it means all sorts of things to all sorts of people. You can read almost anything you want into the lion. What I want to read into this lion is that it's representative in some way of the world. But if you look at it, it's not supine. It's a wonderful evocation of a male lion. If you ever get a chance to go there, have a look, you can get right up to it. They haven't put any barriers around it. Go and have a good look at it. And what you'll see is a lion, a beautifully carved lion, but look what his mouth is doing. There's his mouth. It's got the end of the sword, and it's bent the sword. And it is, in fact, an actual act of the lion bending the sword. Now, John, one of the things that John was actually described as being was, by one of his contemporaries, was soft sword. And some people have said, well, might be a representation of soft sword, but of that nickname. But in fact, if you look at the sword is not soft at all. The sword is a proper sword. It's only at the end that it's being bitten and bent in this particular way. And I think that the argument that I would make is that this is the world in rebellion. That this is in fact creating an image of John, which is not the image of John as a bad ruler, but as a ruler who is attempting to rule as a king should. He looks like a king, he presents as a king, but in fact the world is making this effort to bend the sword of justice, to actually cause injustice, because justice comes from the king. And I think the iconography of this is supposed to give us an idea that the person who created this, the person who commissioned this, the people who commissioned this, were trying to give a very sympathetic image of John. And I think that this is part and parcel of the way in which the community at Worcester were trying to keep hold of John's body. And it's obviously a very successful campaign, because John's body is still there. Or at least it was opened up in 1797 and it was still there. I don't think it's been opened up since. We're as certain as we can be that the body of John is still there. And certainly the altar tomb is there, and certainly the effigy is there, still at the ritual centre of the cathedral community. Now, I hope you've noticed about this particular image, it's highly polished, isn't it? It's very, in terms of modern sensibilities, it's a rather nice image. It's Purbeck marble, and I rather like it. And when I first came across it, I thought, gosh, this is very nice. It fits nicely within the cathedral community. But was it always like this? And in fact, one of the things that we can work out is that it came to be in that particular form by the 4th of June 1930. I can actually date it precisely. And this altar tomb was in this particular state by the 27th of September 1930. It's very, very clear. The documentary tale is very clear. Because, in fact, during the 19th and 20th centuries, this effigy went through an extraordinary set of happenings, and I'd like to tell you something about those particular happenings now. Now, one of the things that art historians are absolutely convinced about is that medieval effigies would have been painted. Polychromatic analysis that has been done on all sorts of effigies, no matter how clean they are, has, in some senses, shown that there's painting that would have been there. And I think we have to imagine that John would have been garishly painted. We've got some evidence for this. There's some written evidence. A man called Richard Simmons, writing in 1645, said that the effigy was gilded. Now, I want you to remember that word, gilded, because that's going to be an important word in the rest of the story. But he didn't say anything about the colours that might have been there. When the tomb was opened up in 1797, the man who opened it up also didn't say anything about the colouring. He's a man called Valentine Green, who was a fellow of this society, this particular society. In 1813, another fellow of this particular society, a man called Alfred Stallard, went to Worcester. And he went to Worcester, drew all sorts of things that he saw there, including John's tomb and his effigy. And this is the way that he represented John's effigy. And so you can see, actually, it's extremely coloured. And it's been argued that Stallard had an exceptionally accurate historical eye. He was employed by the Society of Antiquaries to go off to Normandy to draw pictures of the Bayeux Tapestry, for example. and art historians still use his work as primary evidence for material that has subsequently been lost. And what you can see, I hope, is there is our king in his coronation robes. Unfortunately, the bishops aren't coloured in this particular image, but there is our king. He's got his crown, and there he is in his coronation robe of crimson. It's lined with this pale blue. Another story that's worth telling you is that I have thought for a long time this was green, because actually if you go to the printed versions, they're all a form of green. But if you go back to the British Museum, where Stallard's original drawings are, it's actually this colour. So there's been a process of a printing error that's come into it. So there it is in that nice pale blue. Obviously, you can see the gold borders. You can see this undergarment here, this golden tunic just popping out at the bottom. His hose are red, obviously. He's got these nice black shoes, and they also, I don't know whether you can see, can't really see there, but the spurs are golden. So it's the image of a medieval king. It's an image of medieval kingship in his coronation robes. As I said, the tomb was opened up in 1797 by Valentine Breen. And when he opened up the tomb, what he saw was a king, or the body still in its robes, very much the colour drained from them, actually not wearing a crown but wearing a cap. And the assumption is that this cap was the coronation cap that he would have worn for a week after he received unction with holy oil, and then this is carried around, and then at the death of the king, it's then placed on the king's head as he's put into the tomb. The sword was still there. There were all sorts of other things in the tomb as well. Have you been to the British Library exhibition of Magna Carta? There's some various bits and pieces, aren't there? There's supposed to be a thumb bone. Apparently, according to the curator of that, it's actually a forged thumb bone. But anyway, there's some bits and pieces from the tomb that have allegedly come out. There was also a crucified Christ, which was sold by Sotheby's in the 1980s to a private dealer. I don't know where that's gone, but a bit unfortunate. So this is the 1830 evidence for what the tomb would have looked like. There's also this surprising evidence too. If you've been in the V&A and you've gone into their plaster cast room, you'll see that they have plaster casts of all sorts of things which were made for the Great Exhibition of 1854. One of the things that was made was, here he is, this effigy plaster cast of King John. The lion has still got a hold of the sword, as you can see, but the colouring is also important evidence that, in fact, John's effigy was coloured. So how did we get to this modern image? How did we get to an image of one where we have the effigy in this highly polished state? And in fact, there seem to be two connected stories that were going on in the 19th century, which in part led to the current condition of John's tomb. The first of them is very much the developing sensibilities of the Victorians about artwork in cathedrals. In 1841, there was a parliamentary committee that was set up to think about the artwork that was in Westminster Abbey, that is in Westminster Abbey and that is in St Paul's. At that stage, you were having to pay to go in and see the artwork. Of course, we now have to pay to go in to see the artwork again, but there was a widespread belief that people should be able to go in and see the artwork for free because it was part and parcel of the way that the Victorians were going to encourage civilization and the improvement of public taste. There's also a concern about the state of these particular monuments too, because they were very much falling into disrepair. Of course, the great thing about the Church of England is, though it's the established church, it is not a state church. It means that the state doesn't control what goes on within the communities. because these communities are independent communities, independent certainly of the state, and cathedral communities in the 19th and indeed for most of the 20th century were largely free to do whatever they wanted to the fabric of their communities. This only started to come to an end in the 1970s and 1980s as the cathedrals gave up that independence in order to receive government funding, in order to help them maintain their fabric. So that's the first theme that is going on in the 19th century. The second theme that's going on is very much about the Victorian restorations of medieval churches, which was going on all over the country. And Worcester Cathedral itself went through a massive restoration for about a 20-year period between 1854 and 1874, largely run by the Board of Works, financed by government funding. It's, if you like, the next great building programme of Worcester Cathedral after the 13th century building programme of Worcester Cathedral that created the Gothic church that is now there. And these Victorian restoration, the restoration of Worcester Cathedral, was going on, as I said, in that 20-year period between 1854 and 1874. And in 1872, they were getting to the end of the project, and the man who was in charge of this, a man called George Buckler, started to think about what was going to happen to what he called these dingy tombs. He was thinking about Arthur, and he was thinking also about John. And the decision was made to actually deal with them. So what George Buckler actually wrote, and let me quote a little bit of it, because it gives you a flavour of the man, I think. Let the effigy in the tomb be carefully cleansed of all impurities which have laid over their surfaces, and let the defective joints in the masonry be carefully stopped. You can hear a modern conservationist's toes curling at this particular point, can't you? And in fact, it's not just modern conservationists. The Society of Antiquaries was thoroughly against this in the 1850s. All sorts of things being written about the destruction of medieval fabric. Leaving chip the broken edges as evidence of antiquity, the shields might be touched up, to use an artist's phrase. Lovely, isn't it? Or be re-emblazoned, and the effigy and the supporters be re-gilt. Remember that 1645 comment about the gilding? Re-gilt. Under such circumstances, I should see no impropriety in placing a metal crown on the head. Do you remember that metal crown I showed you? That's the metal crown. And in fact, that's exactly what dear old George Buckler did. Can you see that? That's what he did. By February 1873, the effigy had been gilded. Now, when I was doing the research for this, I came across a reference to a coloured image taken in 1912 of this. I've never been able to track it down. It existed in 1974. If any of you got one in your cupboards or something like that, please let me know. But this from the V&A, it's black and white, but I hope you can see there's the metal, yeah? Can you see the metal? And you can see the shininess of it. It reminds me a bit of a Cyberman, yeah? There was a Doctor Who thing, and it caused absolute outrage. There are letters in the Times from 1873 where people were just absolutely beside themselves with fury about what Buckler had done. Buckler wrote letters defending himself, saying this is what it should have been like, and there was no medieval paintwork. There's a man called Albert Hartshaw who was in the business of doing a survey of all the recumbent effigies in Northamptonshire, came out in 1876. He was a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. He wrote absolutely livid letters saying this is just vandalism of the worst kind. And actually, it's pretty horrible, isn't it? There's that tin crown, which is still in existence. It's the community at Worcester, the librarian still has it, and it does look a bit tinny, doesn't it? Not very pleasant. And again, I hope you can see, it's the gilded, it is actually gilded. I hope you can see the shine. They're not great pictures, it's very difficult with black and white, but that's clearly, I think, what they are trying to represent. It stayed in this particular form for about 50 years. there are various rumblings that were going on. And then in 1907, another fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, a man called William St. John Hope, who was Assistant Secretary to the Society, started the whole process again, wrote to the Dean and Chapter, in fact, found himself an ally in one of the canons, a man called Canon Wilson, and in 1912, Canon Wilson brought all this before the community at Worcester and was sent off to write a report. The report was produced in 1914 and indeed came to the conclusion that gilding of the effigy was an error. The decision at that particular juncture was that the community wanted to do something, but they didn't have enough cash. So it went into abeyance. And then in 1925, the director of the National Portrait Gallery decided that what he really wanted was a bronze cast of King John. Now, I've talked to various keepers in the National Portrait Gallery, and they'll tell you this is a mad thing to ask to do, because it would cost a fortune. £250 apparently in 1925 terms. An absolute insane thing to want to do. But this seems to have started the community thinking again about what it was going to do with its particular effigy. The man who was the driving force behind it then was this man, a man called William Moore Eade. A most remarkable man. He'd been Dean of Worcester since 1908. He had, in fact, been on Tyneside since the 1870s. He was one of these men who you just have to admire, enormous energy, who really did make a difference to his local communities in favour of the old age pensions, school dinners for poor kids, redoing housing, knocking down slum housing and building good housing for working class people, not only in Tyneside but also in Worcester itself. He's a man of extraordinary capacity, somebody who you just have to admire. But he got his bit between the teeth, his teeth, on this particular issue about what was going to happen to the effigy. And he raised money, he started a campaign, he got the then King George V to back his campaign. And what they decided to do was, first of all, to strip the gilding off of the effigy and then to repaint it. And what they wanted to do was to repaint it according to, and here I quote directly, the porcelain model of King John. And this is it. Again, if you've been to the British Library Magna Carta exhibition, you'll see they've got a copy of this, well, it's an inkwell, actually, as you can see. It's an inkwell. And in terms of its size, unfortunately, I didn't bring something to represent it, but in forms of its size, it's about that size. When this particular one came up for sale in 1972, the auctioneer said it was a not uncommon model of King John's tomb in Worcester Cathedral. Never trust auctioneers, they know nothing. I've been back to the archives, I can only find a record of 17 of them being produced. Again, if you see one in the junk shop, get it quickly. 17 of them being produced for particular orders, and they were produced between 1841 and 1844. There's just a 3-year period in which they were being produced. And this is what Moore Eade wanted to repaint the effigy as. It's quite extraordinary. And when I came across the record evidence of this, I thought, porcelain model? What porcelain model? And then I went around and asked people, and they said, oh yeah, the porcelain model. Go and have a look in the Porcelain Museum, the Worcester Porcelain Museum. So off I trot, and there it is. And I look at it and think, this is amazing. And so did people at the time. The Bishop of Worcester wrote to the Dean and said, you must be joking, you cannot do this. Please take advice. Because as you all know, bishops have no power in their cathedrals. The cathedrals are run by the Dean and the Chapter. So the bishop merely has his seat there. But this happens every time, doesn't it?
Sorry, just the red X.
Do you think it's time we updated this? Then this wouldn't happen. Well, it's actually quite a good one, because it's the time thing. It reminds me that time is running on, doesn't it? So the Bishop of Worcester said, you cannot be serious about this, don't do it. The director of the V&A wrote to Maureen and said, please don't do this to your effigy. The letters are all there in the Worcester Cathedral archive. E.W. Tristram, who was a painter himself, fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, worked extensively with the tombs at Westminster Abbey, wrote and said, please don't do this. But Maureen was a man with a mission, and indeed he did decide that what he wanted to do was to redo the effigy. And what he seems to have done is got a company called Bridgman & Son. Now, Bridgman & Son is still going, and I've written to them several times asking to see their archives, and they won't let me in. And you could kind of understand why. Because what happened was that in April 1930, they came along and they got a can of paint stripper and threw it over the effigy. And that's how they got rid of the gilding. They decided that paint stripper was the answer, because, of course, what they were then going to do was paint on top of it. And this is an extract from E.W. Tristram's letter. And I want you to imagine, if you can, the outrage in Tristram's voice. I am not surprised that little of the original colour was found in King John's effigy. To work down to it by means of a paint remover could only end in fatal results. That there was original colour in the effigy I could see for myself, and in competent hands the work of recovery could have been carried out successfully. Maureen had actually invited Tristram down to come and have a look at his effigy and give him advice, and this was whilst it was still in its gilded form, and yet he had refused to accept his advice. It's very clear as well that Maureen bullied his community of his chapter as well. His chapter, in the end, decided that they were going to stand up to him. And in fact, on the 4th of June 1930, they said, actually, you can go no further. What you need to do is to stop what you're doing, polish the effigy. You can touch up these things on the side of the altar tomb, but actually you need to leave the effigy alone. And indeed, Maureen did. He had it polished up in that particular form, and the effigy was left alone. And then he reported back to the next meeting of the chapter on the 27th of September 1930, said that everything had been done, everything was all sorted, and then he wrote himself a wonderful memorandum. He died in 1935. It's a wonderful memorandum in which he wrote it in the third person. And when you read it, you just absolutely staggered, because one of the things he says toward the end is, the work was completed to universal approval. That's called deluding yourself, isn't it? In 1997, the Courtauld Institute came down and did a polygrammatic survey of the effigy, in fact of other effigies within Worcester Cathedral. And what they discovered was that there were tiny fragments of the medieval paint, or at least of paint, it was so small they couldn't test it to see if it was medieval. But one of the things that it did show was that Charles Alfred Stallard in 1813 was absolutely right in terms of the colours that he had represented for us. So in fact, it looks like this was, as we thought, a highly coloured effigy of King John that, in the Middle Ages, would have been vibrant in its colouring. Thank you very much.